So for many years, I've come to the fair, and this is our first stop. We get our maple coffee and our maple donut, and then we spend the morning moving around through the fair. It was 1976. I spent 10 days out here working with people to make photographs. And what I loved about the fair was, at the fair, everybody loses that sense of decorum. And so people were more than willing to come in and make a picture with me. This was the first time I had ever really enjoyed making pictures with people. That wasn't the kind of work I'd been doing. And in many ways, it's the start of where my work went over the next 3 decades. The fair gave me a license where I felt okay about pointing a camera at someone. In fact, I found they enjoyed it, and it was a breakthrough for me.
Now here for 1 week at the Champlain Valley Exposition, Professor Higgins brings you Patagraphics, his studio, assisted by the beauteous Miss Jane. Patagraphics, ladies and gentlemen. The only studio on the Midway using solely the energy and light derived from that golden orb which daily doth traverse our zenith. Yes, hurry, 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 ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, hi.
Dan. Come on in.
Thank you.
Welcome to Winooski. It's a great little stove.
Roaring, we should be warm.
September, I rented a space at the Champlain Valley Fair. I had an old Army truck. I had a canvas that came down. It said Patagraphics. It was a reference to Alfred Jarry and the French pataphysics movement. Alfred Jarry was a satirical playwright. Satire, making fun of things, seems to have been a big part of their philosophy. I guess part of what pataphysics to me was the engagement of the world in a way that adds confusion. It was carnival. We were into the carnival thing. And Irving Penn had done a series. It was really anthropology, but fashion. And I was really impressed with it. He had a small tent, and he was doing exotic African girls in their outfits, and I think he did Hell's Angels. He got different people into his tent. So that was the inspiration. So I sent up my canvas out there. I did have some props, and I allowed people to choose props because it becomes theater. And the person is involved in the manufacturing of the image. So now those were not particularly important props to them. They were hats and kinds of things, but it created that sense that they were involved in the making of the picture. Taking photographs to me means wandering around with a camera and taking, something, taking it. These were all consensual. They were collaborative. There was nothing sneaky. I let people reshoot if they wanted to bring someone else in. I think I charged them $1 to get a postcard mailed back to them. I bring my students down. It was that era of great fraternization. I had students wandering around. Joan Savoy was one of my students. They had coupons that I gave them, and they could hand them out.
What sort of people did you bring in?
Oh, all kinds. It was a full spectrum of humanity at the Champlain Valley Fair.
There was a group of people that had come from a nursing home. and someone had said, well, you should go down to the Patagraphics Photo Center. Photographs are free today. So I look around, and there's like 6 or 7 people in wheelchairs all lined up waiting for a photograph. One of the things was called the pig with the human foot. And this little pig had been born with 5 digits. And they loved this pig. I think we did a picture with him and the grandchildren. So hanging out there and getting to know all these people, we sort of were part of the fair. And then people would ask me if I would do a picture for them, like Buttons, the world's smallest horse. On the painting, it looked as if the horse could stand in your hand. The horse was actually the size of a dog. So they wanted me to make a picture of them with their horse for promotion purposes, which was great. It was a 10-day fair, and it was really, really fun. Whatever the project is, it has a logic of its own. And being at the fair, it was about exaggeration. That's where the tape came from. My friend Earl came out. I would go teach at UVM, and he would sit up in the Winooski block and do these tapes. Everywhere had tapes, Big Jack, the world's largest steer.
Magic lens of the photographer extraordinaire, Professor Higgins. For 1/100th of $100 bill, Professor Higgins, who has photographed the crowned princes and kings and queens of Suriname, the Shah of Pashba, and other notables. Professor Higgins has been known to photograph 1,000 blades of grass in one setting. In all the concatenation of the universe, no one has escaped the magic lens of Professor Higgins. So hurry, 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 hurry.
It's all gone back to the fair. And I think it was October of that same year that I began the Onion Portraits, which was just finding anybody I could in Winooski and asking them, not if I could take their picture, but would you help me with a project I'm doing? They didn't know me.
Winooski, where Dan lived, was across the bridge from Burlington, Vermont. The economic engine of Winooski for more than 100 years had been the mills that manufactured yarns and wove cotton and wool. When they closed in 1954, 3,000 employees were thrown out of work. A large cultural mix remained in Winooski, which included mostly French Canadians, but also Poles, Russians, Irish, Germans, Italians, and Syrians. In 1973, in the name of urban renewal, the town fathers of Winooski had torn down half the center of the city, but had run out of money before rebuilding it. 3 years later, Dan began the Onion series. Over the years, the changing face of Winooski would be his focus.
I wanted to make photographs of all these people that I'd been meeting that I knew were in jeopardy with what was happening with the changing new town. It was a little funky bar. Tattoo Dixon was the owner, and there was only room on the window to write American Rest. It was too small to write restaurant, and I loved that name, the American Rest. So after he folded, 1976, I rented it for 1 month. And that's when I asked all the artists that I knew to join me for 1 month on the American Rest project. I asked that each of them during that month make a piece of art in whatever medium that was their response to Winooski.
We had performances and slideshows and stuff every evening, every day and every evening. That place was open for a month. I did a series of collages and I took photographs in Winooski, what was then Forest Hills Factory Outlet. This is a picture of the Winooski block where Dan lived. I have something odd going on in each window. The one Dan liked the best was of Henry's Cafe. And Winooski was kind of rough back then, and there were lots of fights and stuff. Jane Kramer did a Winooski block, soup tureen. Paul Aschenbach did a sculpture, Winooski Falls. Marion Ettlinger did a collage, post-urban renewal landscape. Greg Blaisdell, for 31 days, he would walk around and he'd pick up litter, paper litter, and then make it into paper pulp and make these simple cones.
Sam said it was about the best art show ever.
Yeah, because it kept changing every day. Every day it would change, and every night we'd have some event.
Every day, I could get someone. I got this guy on the cover of this book. He was one of the first ones, an old guy that I knew, and he was willing to pose with an onion. The onion became an obvious prop. Winooski is an Abenaki word that means wild onion. And the onion, also being a kind of non-gentrified vegetable, had some of that roughness and that raw quality that I associated with the blue-collar town. It was very photogenic to hold a big onion or to hold a couple of them. And so it became the prop that allowed people to not be so self-conscious about having their picture taken. They were doing something. By holding the onion, it became an embrace of locality. And every day I would put a new one up, and by the third or fourth or fifth day, I could watch people coming out of the other restaurants and pointing and going in and bringing people out to see who it was. And by the end of that week, people were asking when I was going to include them. So the whole exhibition had become a local theater. You had cachet if you were included. in the 70s and even the 80s, if I wanted to show my work, I would make large prints and I would put them in all the windows on Main Street. And this would become a walking show, and people would start at the top of the hill and they would walk down and they would look at the pictures. And so the windows were basically a gallery space that everyone saw. Love the one of the barber. How people held the onion was very interesting.
This is me. I lived in an apartment right across from Henry's Cafe. I'd be lying in bed reading, and somebody, baby Dan, would say, "Hey, Fry, you want to go get a beer?" And I'd go, "Okay, yeah." And then I'd be in my nightgown, and I just put on my winter coat and walk across the parking lot to the mill, which is really, when I first knew Dan, that's where he'd be sitting at the bar at the mill. These t-shirts are famous, and I still have my threadbare, I mean, it's falling apart. It's a relic of these t-shirts that Dan made. On the back is "See America by Truck," and on the front is one of Dan's army trucks. But I modified the neckline. See? On the cover, you see another t-shirt he made, because he was such a Winooski booster. Here,
Exactly.
Nick DeFries and George.
Who are the real Vermonters, right? Well, I think Dan's definition is it's not necessarily the rural farmers. We love them, but we forget about the urban mix that we have created. Well, people make a lot of fun of Vermont. There's no diversity up here. And you say, look at it again. Dan is making us aware of the fact that it's very rich. It just has a feel for not the stereotypical, but for the everyday, the commonplace, which is why you have to sort of look, I think, a little more carefully at what he's about. I say, oh, well, this is the Girl Scouts from Winooski. Well, begin to look at the individual characters and the interaction.
It had the magic of both, the making of the photograph and then the exhibiting and creating the dialogue. So that, to me, was where it really began, my interest in using photography to work with groups of people. The subject matter is community, it's not the individuals.
It was at a time in the 70s when photography was pretty much smitten with the zone system of Minor White and Ansel Adams, these beautiful, clear, clean, black and white photographs, mostly of landscapes. Or there was the kind of casual street photography of Lee Friedlander. And what was interesting about Dan was his commitment to document what was happening in Winooski as an anthropologist. So the photographs were never about photography as art. They were about photography as they help us to understand what social change is all about. It kind of reminded me of the Winooski version of Lewis McAllister. And McAllister was a great photographer of the community of Burlington.
Group shot, that's L.L. McAllister's big info. I love his work. Those big panoramic pictures that you see everywhere.
Everyone in the city comes down.
Yeah, 1,500 people. You can't get 1,500 people together anymore for a photograph, but you could. He could.
I always thought Dan's work was a kind of a cross between McAllister and Lewis Hine, who'd also spent some time in and around the turn of the last century in Winooski documenting what was going on at the mills.
And my work continues from that place, and it's always fallen somewhere in between anthropology and art. My Belize trip came after the Winooski onion portraits, and I was excited about doing portraits of people, and I thought that's the best way to learn about a place. So I took a big twin lens reflex camera, tripod. I went to Belize and I spent 3 months just traveling around Belize, making photographs with people, and my promise was that I would send them all a postcard, which I did. When I got back to Vermont, I sent out about 150 postcards.
The picture of the gang members, was that scary?
They were kidding me. It wasn't scary. They were just surprised that this white guy would go off into the woods with them to make a photograph. what if we steal your camera? And I said, well, I'm sort of assuming that might happen, but I'd rather you didn't hurt me. No, it was joking. Belize was the same size as Vermont. The population was the same. But in Belize, you have the Mayan people, you have the Creole, the black English-speaking African. Belize, by the way, at that time was British Honduras. It hadn't become Belize. And you had the Mennonites that do all the farm work. And I wanted to explore as many of these different groups as I could, because unlike Vermont, which was so homogeneous, here was this amazing place that I had no comprehension about what I was doing there. And that was really exciting. When I was in art school and when I was studying anthropology, narrative was a bad word. The social sciences in the 1960s, the emphasis was on quantitative data. Out in the Midwest, in Michigan, the art professors were all looking to New York. They were looking to abstract painters. That was real art. Narrative was kind of kitschy. You know, you don't paint things the way they look. And I was doing political posters. I was doing big lithographs during the Vietnam War. And when I was in Ann Arbor, much of what I did graphically was, in my sense, pataphysical. And so it didn't fit at all into what art was considered. I became very close friends with the professor that taught lithography. He actually hired me to assist him doing stone lithographs. And so I was doing a lot of that, and he said, you know, if you would take another semester, you could get a degree in art, an MFA. So I did it, and I actually have an MFA. I was doing archaeology in the 60s, in the summers. One of the things we did in both Michigan and Ohio, Upper Peninsula, was called survey work, where you would be sent into a community to try to find out from local people if there were any known sites where farmers had run their plow through something and found ceramics, let's say. So when I was working in Kelly's Island, Ohio, I rented an airplane and a pilot, and I went up over the island and I made aerial pictures. And then I printed those 16 by 20. And I'd walk around with this thing, and I could sit at the laundromat or the restaurant or whatever, and it was like a magnet. People wanted to come and look at it. They would first of all find their home. Oh my God, our roof looks really bad. The neighbor told us, blah, blah, blah. So one of the things that fascinates me about photography, and it's an important part of it, is how easy it is to get people to look at a photograph and tell you what they see in it. I mean, that's magic. That doesn't happen with a drawing. I was teaching an archaeology field crew in the Midwest, and one of the women on the crew with me decided to go to Woodstock. So I borrowed a friend's car, and we were driving to Woodstock, and we started hearing on the radio how crowded it was. And I don't like crowds at all. And I said, let's go down to Burlington, where I have a friend, Bill Davison, taught in the art department. So we're down at Bill's, and he got a phone call that told him that the person that was going to be teaching a printmaking class at UVM couldn't do it. And he said, do you want to teach, I think it was etching. You know, I said, yeah, why not? Everyone said, if you want to find a cheap place to live, go to Winooski. Well, I didn't know what Winooski was. I assumed it was some other town. It's right over the bridge.
Ever since the mills had closed in 1954, Winooski had a lot of people out of work and a lot of vacancy.
People were told Winooski was a really scary place to be. And I went into the trackside. The bartender, turns out, was wrestling with someone outside the bar, and the other guy at the bar said, just go back, get what you want, and remember. There was something so relaxed about it. They all started telling me, Russell Niquette has a lot of property. He was the owner of the Winooski block. He showed me this incredible space, and he said, we like to get paid on time at $60 a month. I said, fine, no problem. And I fell into a space that now is 4 apartments, the 3rd floor up there.
Were you the first hippie to come to Winooski?
I don't know if I was a hippie, but I probably was perceived as a hippie. But it wasn't like Detroit or Ann Arbor in 1969. Both Detroit and Ann Arbor had the National Guard because it was so contentious. I mean, it was the Vietnam War. I was driving that old Army truck. I was getting stopped all the time. You know what it is? I looked a lot like John Sinclair. Do you know who he was? White Panther. He was a musician. He and I looked a lot alike, and he was wanted. Anyway, I came to Vermont. You didn't have any of that tension. There were a lot of communes, and those people would come up to Winooski to print their posters because I had the silkscreen set up. You know those Vermont Vietnam posters that John has done? So it was a really great gathering spot.
And you met Jane during this period, didn't you?
Jane was one of those commune people that came up to print posters.
I just have to know.
Yes.
When you met Dan in 1973 up in the Winooski block, I think you
Yes.
told me that's when you met. Mm-hmm. Was it love at first sight?
There were so many factors. I don't think love at first sight is the answer, but maybe. Sure, I'll say yes.
Yes, okay. You don't have to say yes.
I didn't see him first. I mean, I saw him up at school,
Yes.
you know, up at the university, because I was taking that ceramic course from Hideo Okino. So we'd always, at the end of the day and at the end of his day, we'd be going out on the same stairs, up the same stairs for lunch.
You kept bumping into him.
Yeah, and then one day he said, "Want to have lunch?"
And you were ready for that.
Yeah, I was ready.
You already had Rain, right? I think Rain was
Yes, yeah,
3 or so.
yeah.
So that makes things more complicated.
No, it was fine.
It was. Okay.
Yeah, she liked Dan. She thought Dan was a cat's meow.
It was a unique art department. It was very much place-based, both in terms of the faculty being mainly happy to be in Vermont and wanting to explore Vermont and using Vermont in their art. And aside from that, using their art to connect outside of the universities with the community. That was not just me. I mean, that gave me a license to do it. Hewitt really pushing place-based art. Paul Aschenbach, the whole time, worked with students. His whole thing was public art. He had students all along the waterfront down there, pounding marble and getting out into Vermont, not in a gallery situation. Public art, he would put it everywhere, and Frank would argue with him that public art should be moved, it shouldn't last. Paul would say, okay, if anyone's got the money and the energy to move it, they can move it. Of course, the solstice parties at Paul's were major community events. Terry Dinnan was a very early student of mine, and Paul became a kind of a mentor, and he built all these structures out there for solstice fires. I think it was around 1971 or 72, the various universities were starting to adopt photography as an academic area. It's questionable. I questioned whether that was a smart idea or not myself at the time. But some universities were bringing photography in for English departments, for journalism. The art department decided they wanted to teach photography. I set up the dark room and I was able to start teaching photography as a class.
Early on in a photography class that I had with Dan, he said to the class, okay, we're going to go to Winooski and just walk around the community and take some pictures. He basically turned us on to the incredible culture that was in people's backyards. And this was before people really got forced out of the center of Winooski. When I first arrived at UVM, I heard Winooski was basically the pits. So then you go there with Dan, who is living there. He just really opened me up when it was still possible for that to happen. One of his first projects was like, okay, put down your cameras. We're going to build some cameras out of cardboard.
The attraction of pinhole photography is that basically a camera is a box. It takes away the mystery and the mystique of all these automatic cameras and all this f-stop business. As one knows with cameras, the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. And with a small pinhole, you have almost infinite depth of field, which means people could set up perspectives where elements close to the camera would be just as much in focus as elements further away, and that is unique to the pinhole camera. By making the box, by measuring the size of the pinhole, by measuring the distance from the pinhole to the back, you can figure out what an f-stop is. By testing your materials, you can figure out what kind of, they call it a shutter speed. Basically, with a pinhole, you're just taking a piece of black tape off the opening.
I ended up getting really excited about pinhole photography and doing a lot of it for the next 10 years or so.
I came to UVM as a student, and at first I was like, he's cool. He had army trucks. He was a photographer, smart, had great parties in the Winooski block. My roommate decided to have a surprise birthday party for me, but in the morning. And there you see Dan, and whenever you see Dan in a group photo, you'll see in his hand he's holding the remote.
In 1971, I had a Vermont Council of the Arts position as an artist in residence in Winooski Middle School. In the 55-minute sessions at the school with bells ringing and so forth, it was not very conducive to making art. The school had no problem at all letting me just meet all these kids after school. There were no permission slips. They rode around in my army truck with me. I had each of them choose an image in Winooski that they felt was essential. We then had that printed up as a 12 scenic views of Winooski card. And then they all had copies and they could give them out. These were 8th graders, and their fascination was with professional wrestling. And they fought all the time about whether it was real or whether it was staged. At the time, at Memorial Auditorium in Burlington, once a month, the professional wrestling took place. I went down on a Thursday night, and they were all down there, and we bought some of the glossy 8x10 photographs of the wrestlers. Mad Dog Vachon, Eel the Fish Poisson. It was quite a crew. And I told them, okay, next week, I'm going to meet you after school, and I'm going to take you up to UVM, and I'm going to show you how to put these images onto a silk screen, which we did. And I said, next week, you're going to come to my studio and bring as many T-shirts as you want, and we will print these images, which we did. And then what was really fun was the next time the wrestlers were in town, down at Memorial, I went to watch, and they were all strutting around in their Mad Dog Vachon T-shirts. And they would come up to me in the bleachers with their friends, and they'd say, Mr. Higgins, would you tell these guys that we made these ourselves? It was so empowering for them to have these things that no one else had. I think it was 1971, and I'd only been here since '69, where all of the faculty collaborated together to do a show. And I believe most of us made the show about wherever Goddard happened to be. I found a road that ran from one end of the county to the other. Every 75 seconds, I stopped the car, and I made a picture down the center of the road. Oh, and I also had written what was on the radio. So here I am in Vermont, but I'm still hearing about the war in Vietnam, and I wanted people to respond. I had sheets of paper underneath it, and they wrote on it. I showed it both up at Goddard and in the town. We found 2 totally different shows going on. The people that lived in the town responded mostly to locations that they recognized, whereas most of the responses from up at Goddard had to do with the audio material that had to do with the war, it had to do with bombing. And that's what's so interesting about an exhibit. What do people bring to it, and what do you learn about the people who are looking at your work? You had many of the faculty buying land in Vermont. Frank Hewitt bought his land in Corinth. That was more interesting to him than the art world. And he used that place with his students. He would take students over there all the time. He had on his land projects. Bill Lipke bought land. Bill Davison bought land, a hilltop. And I found a mountaintop. It was totally inaccessible. You had to walk in a long way to get there. I used to go up there every weekend and, hike in and spend the time there, build.
We have a picture from the cabin on Tower Mountain. Jimmy Swift and I would go up there with Dan. We went up a couple times just to see if we could get some lumber up there, and we didn't quite make it to the very top.
Once a year, they have a big jamboree. It was in May, and I would invite people up with their tents. Kegs of beer would come up, and people would make big pots of beans and rice. And
You took food.
Yes,
carried
I
food
remember
up.
the breakfast particularly. I couldn't remember much in the having vodka. I mean, I wasn't really a drinker.
sunny, good weather, May day, you'd get maybe 100 people up there. On a rainy, grim, cold day, you might get 13 stalwarts.
Artists, musicians, writers, people would go up there for 2 or 3 days, and normally you would see them around town or whatever, but all of a sudden you're on the top of a mountain for a few days. One of the things I think is really important about Dan, he really, almost more than anybody, nurtured the community.
You were involved in filming the destruction of Winooski.
1973, I think, is when urban renewal really began, and I found it fascinating, and I filmed it from my window on the Winooski block. This is what Winooski looked like from an aerial view that I had hired a plane to fly over. And you can see the main street. Now there's a big rotary in here. This whole east half of Main Street was torn down.
The urban renewal area before construction looked like this. It's the kind of neighborhood that most places in the country aspire to having in their downtowns. These photographs here that were compiled by Dan Higgins, you can see what Main Street looked like before demolition. On the left, most of these buildings still remain. On the right, this is the site of the urban renewal area, and these are the buildings that were actually destroyed. And you can see there's very little difference between the two, but this was part of the area selected by Winooski for demolition.
I didn't have to do time lapse or that because it happened so fast. And you just had that empty field there for, I think, about 6 or 7 years. It was a strange place. There was a guy that tied his horse up there to a tree. By the later 70s, urban renewal had fallen out of favor. And the federal money wasn't there anymore. And what Winooski did was, with no sense of irony or They applied now for all these buildings on the other side of the street, the Winooski block, the mills, and so forth. They applied for historic preservation money for them, saying these were really historically important buildings all of a sudden.
As a result of urban renewal, there's a large parking area. The Champlain Mill was preserved. The Winooski block was saved. A new one-story shopping center with a grocery store and some other services was developed, but mostly the center was empty.
With historic preservation, with the places becoming a little more elegant, they weren't places where people would hang out all day and play shuffleboard. You know, you come in and pay for a sort of expensive meal and you get out and make room for the next. It was a different model of what the spaces were used for.
No, I think it's too rich for Winooski. I just went to the waterworks and had a drink. Who can afford it? I couldn't afford that place.
When Henry goes, What are the guys gonna do? They'll have to dress up to go on the street to get a drink. It's gonna be rough.
Yeah. Historic preservation was as problematic for the social life of the downtown as urban renewal had been. The restaurants were places where people hung out, played shuffleboard. They'd hang out all day and drink beer, talk, or whatever. They weren't going to be able to stay here anymore. You had people going off into federally subsidized low-income housing, federally subsidized senior centers, halfway houses. And I continued photographing places that I knew were going to disappear. A lot of the mix that you had in the 70s, it was artists, it was people not on great income. You had crazy people put in their own little kind of segregated silos, and that's gotten worse. I had been living in the Winooski block for almost 10 years, I guess. It was 1980, and the historic preservation money meant I had to get out of the Winooski block pretty fast. I got kicked out of my $60 a month living space. This space down here had been empty for a few years, and this was the first RVA. This was in the 1940s. And then when the mills closed, the RVA moved down to one of those nice brick buildings. And this building became taken over by Essex Manufacturing, and they had women that sewed garments. This was original, this ran the whole way. And it was my luck, both of these parcels were up for sale. I moved down here, and because they were gutting the Winooski block, they let me take anything that I wanted. So these windows, that bookcase, all the kind of stuff that turns a place into a place where you can live, I just dragged down the hill. And then this other place that we call the Video Cafe was built by Terry Dinnan and me as a gathering spot, as a studio. It's all recycled Winooski. These windows are all from the Champlain Mill. When they were putting in new windows, they were throwing these out.
So where did these booths come from?
They come from Henry's Cafe. It was one of the old gathering spots of the old Winooski guys. It was a lot of guys that had worked in the mills. He'd open around 5:30 in the morning. These guys would come down for their Canadian club and their donut.
They told me you use Brillo pad even on the cups?
Yes, I do.
Cups and saucers?
You know why? Girls that use lipstick.
Oh, yeah.
So, Henry, how long you been here? In this place?
Yep.
In the business?
Yes.
I have been here 23.25 years. I owned the home right down the street, right here. A nice home, a 2-apartment house. I owned it. And that got torn down. That was a crime what they done to this town. It was a real crime.
You had Corporation Hall where people came down in the afternoons to play bingo. Huge. People would show up at 5 in the afternoon with their Tupperware containers, and they would do up to 72 cards each.
Bingo, I guess, is the last thing. 3:30 in the afternoon, take all the parking spaces. You can find a place to park one if you wanted to.
M36. And your 6th number for $70 is 061. We have a bingo.
And they smoked like crazy in there, and so eventually the place burned down. 1984. Somebody assuming that I was the archivist. Somehow this badly smoked bingo machine was brought over to me. That's why I have it. When Henry closed, he gave me the sign, and he said, "I've got to promise to have a party here at least once a year." And I said, "There's no problem."
This is where you used to host Halloween parties.
This was the site of the Halloween parties. They started in 1980. Winooski was the central focus of Halloween. Everyone came to Winooski. There were 3 major parties. So I put a little sign out with a flashing light saying photo postcards. And so people were flocking into Winooski.
Hundreds of people would come through. This was my father and me. He didn't have a costume. That was Halloween 1980.
And that was the start. I did it for 9 years. People thought about their year, what a year had been. So like I remember the woman from the Daily Planet had a rough year with a breakup, and she came all battered with a crutch, and she created a version of herself that she wanted documented and then move on from. So there was a kind of a socio-psycho element to how people dealt with Halloween. It wasn't just let's get dressed up and have a party. You know, people, there was transgender. And those photographs, I have all those photographs, over 1,000.
You can pay $5 and be sure to get a postcard. Where'd my notebook go? There's too many people.
That's Kathleen Schneider, Judy Porter. There's Marty, that's Terry's girlfriend. Jane, Jack, who started both Sneakers and the Black Rose and Daily Planet. 1984, CCTV was 1984. Public access basically started right here. And it was Lauren Glenn Davidian. She had graduated from UVM in anthropology, I might point out. And I ran into her because I was filming things like the inside of Henry's Cafe.
I had decided I was going to do my anthropology thesis on the changing life of Winooski. So everyone said, you have to go talk to Dan Higgins because he's Mr. Winooski. We were kindred spirits immediately. And I was so interested in the work that he did, how he used art to build community. So he and I started to document these stories.
She's the one that knew that if you pushed the right buttons, you could get the cable companies to open up public access. There was no public access.
I quickly assembled a group of people and went to the Public Service Board, and the Public Service Board required the cable company to provide funding and channels. They gave us a channel. We got our own equipment, and we started to produce these programs. The first program, we were all gathered to watch the cable company hapless person who had to put the tape in on some other location, and they just couldn't get the tape in. We were all there to watch this 8 o'clock premiere. Something would go on, it would flicker, and it wasn't until 9 o'clock actually that they got our first tape in there. So Dan was involved in the very first programs that we produced in 1984.
People would gather here with their videotapes.
When Chittenden Community Television was born 5 years ago, the founders expected nothing.
I don't even remember expecting anything because we knew that we would have to invent this as we went along.
That made it easy to surpass their expectations, and they have.
Happy birthday, dear CCTV.
At age 5, public access television produces about 8 hours of original programming each week.
I like boring television. I mean, I like real time. I don't think everyone that's involved in CCTV feels the same way I do, but I'm very comfortable. It's like the aldermen's meetings. They're incredibly boring, but I like the fact they're just on.
This is not a place where you would find Dan Higgins. He dislikes studios so much, and I have to agree with him, is that they're the most deadening places to actually show what's happening in a community.
The show was Winooski Live, and I said, every episode, once a month, let me have 30 minutes of video that's shot in the community. And it was great, and I tried to have 6 or 7 different vignettes on every 30-minute interview.
Been told by a number of people that this is the best sub in Winooski.
Yes, it
And
is.
so we thought we'd just drop in and see you make one.
All right, then. We're going to make a turkey bacon. Everybody likes the turkey bacon.
So how many of these subs do you put on in a week?
Well, a day can range between 50 to 100, depends.
Wow.
The first day I moved down there, I was so happy to be here because it's a quiet place. We have band here. Life is about that. It's about sharing everything. You know, you guys can share your culture with us. We can share us culture with you guys.
And we have parties for years. We had them at the Video Cafe. The Video Cafe is our home and our birthplace.
The other thing is that June 13th is also Jane's birthday. They were always coinciding. Generally, the parties would be here. They've outgrown this place now, but it would always be a double birthday party. The environment right now in terms of media is completely different. There are people expressing themselves on the internet, on YouTube. It's a proliferation. It's a totally different situation. But in 1984, putting up an hour-long TV show in a community where people actually saw their neighbors and friends and real people doing stuff was revolutionary.
There were political events Dan was behind. There was a protest against our involvement in Central and South America.
This week, 16 Vermont artists are collaborating in a nationwide artist call against U.S. intervention in El Salvador.
The first goal is to make North Americans aware of Central American culture, which is a rich culture that has been involved in a struggle for 150, 200 years. The second goal is to make North American artists respond to what is going on down there. And the third goal is to raise money for support for cultural groups in Central America, El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Throughout the week, artists and the public will be welcome to bring in art, share ideas, and take place in a series of events and discussions.
And a lot of the work isn't as specifically oriented towards Central America as toward a feeling of a kind of inherent violence.
This week was chosen for the call because it's the 52nd anniversary of a government massacre of 30,000 Salvadorans. And these artists believe that was the beginning of the end of El Salvador's indigenous culture. Alexandra Marks, News Center 22 from Burlington.
Since 1853, the United States has invaded Nicaragua 14 times.
Did you order this?
What is it?
Well, actually, you're paying for it, so what I'd like to do is give you a menu. This happens to be the United States intervention in Central America, the helicopter, the military, and we keep gearing up for more.
What's your response been so far?
I've ran into a pretty positive response. People are willing to listen. One gentleman who was still concerned about communism and the fight over communism, so we talked a little bit about that. Hi, did you order this?
No.
Well, you've been paying for it.
In 1984, the City Council proclaimed Burlington, Vermont, to be the sister city of Puerto Cabezas. This port community of 20,000 people is on the isolated Atlantic coast of Nicaragua.
I think that what this is about, a sister city relationship between Burlington and a similar type city in Nicaragua, is of extraordinary importance. We will be able to stand up definitively for peace and for the needs of the people rather than for war and destruction.
My interest in Nicaragua began in 1979 with the Sandinista Revolution. They overthrew the Somoza dictatorship, which had been supported by the United States, and they set up a socialist government. And when Reagan became the president in 1980, he saw this as a communist threat to the hemisphere. Reagan was secretly selling weapons to the Iranians to pay for the Contras to go make life as miserable as possible for Nicaraguans. All of the media in the 1985 and 60s, you couldn't pick up a newspaper without some story and photograph about the war in Nicaragua. We didn't learn much about our sister cities. My plan was to photograph the same social situation in Burlington as in Puerto Cabezas. And I started with a list of what I thought made up a community. And the idea was to make photographs that would be seen as pairs. Here's a place where you get coffee in Burlington, the Oasis Diner, and they're posing. They brought out their pie, it's got the menu, it's got enough information that tells the story of the Oasis. And then my idea was to go down to Puerto Cabezas and look for a place where I could get a cup of coffee. And they brought out their rolls and their beans. And it didn't work out very well the first year because people were understandably suspicious of me. There was a war going on. Here's this gringo. I think I made a few pictures. Here's barbers, a barber in his barber shop. If you look closely, you'll see they're wearing the same shirt. But a lot of people resisted me. Here's City Hall. You can tell which is which. One City Hall, you see more rubber boots than... And Bernie's in it. That was the crew that was at the City Hall. In '87, I went back, and that's when I had an opportunity at the Casa de Cultura. When I showed the photographs in the town, that people started coming up to me saying, we want to be included. This is of the nurses who do the laundry in the basement of the hospital. They were very pleased because there had been a material aid, and this dryer had actually come from Burlington. So then I came back to Burlington, and I had to find the women who do laundry at the hospital.
Where are you, Dan?
Back here.
Oh my gosh. In the depths of the basement.
I'm just going to pull out random samples. All right, that's acid rain. Acid rain, acid rain. This is Sister City stuff. Some of them are in color. And my feeling was that cab drivers have a lot more in common than the Cold War rhetoric, how different these people are. In Burlington, the skateboarders were demonized. And in Puerto Cabezas, the shoeshine boys had a similar irritating responsibility. You know, there was a woman in Burlington that was called the hot dog lady. So her equivalent was a woman who makes up a chicken and rice meal and wraps it up in banana leaves. It was because of the comparison that the piece really has any meaning.
Everybody came down to that show, and they saw their own photographs in big, they were big format photographs. And they're, smudging all this, like, there's me, and that's me. And they just were so excited.
The most fun part was that some of the shoeshine boys decided that they should have the picture of them. So it disappeared from the show. And the people running the place were really freaked out. I said, listen, they're photographs. We can make more. That's not a problem. And no, we got to get these back. So they sent the security. They got this photograph back, and it disappeared again. So they were really pissed then. So they went out, and I can't remember if they got that photograph back, but I had another copy. I just put it up. But for the rest of the show, they had a Sandinista soldier sitting with an automatic rifle guarding the gallery. I've never had that kind of security. This is a picture of the exhibition at City Hall in Burlington.
We had seen these photographs on the walls of City Hall in different places, and we said to ourselves, this really calls to be put into a book.
Robin Lloyd, thank you very much. And we're at the Boathouse in Burlington for the signing and presentation of Dan Higgins' new book, Sister Cities Side by Side. Okay, we're with Doreen Kraft, the producer of the book and this function as well. Is that right?
That's right, in Green Valley. I'm working with Green Valley and with the Sister City program, who are both responsible for the book. Everyone came and gave their $10 donations, their $25 or their larger ones, and made this book possible. So it really is truly a community project.
And I find that when you take the pictures back into the community, the equation is completed in a way, and there's a kind of trust, and there's something that happens where you gain access to that community.
During the 1980s and 90s, I made several trips to Nicaragua, making photographs each time of individuals, of groups of people. One of my favorite memories was a 1995 show where, in order to get the Casa de Cultura ready for the exhibition, it was very dirty. The fire department, the volunteer firemen came. They volunteered to come over and wash the Casa de Cultura inside and outside with their fire hoses. And we had volunteers who cleaned up the grounds. We painted the place. We put the show up. And again, most of the people in the town came. And it was a youth group, did a performance at the opening. They prepared a dance for the opening. And a local seamstress sewed a backdrop for me, and I had a small photo studio set up outside the Casa de Cultura where people could come and have a postcard made. The Autonomous University Huracan had been formed a couple of years earlier with the mission of documenting and celebrating the multi-ethnic nature of the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. So we went down in the year 2000, got some help locally. We bought 5 video cameras, we got an editing deck, and Huracan ran an ad on the radio saying that anybody who wanted to learn how to do video work should come to a class that I would be offering.
And 19 people showed up from the students and the community.
I first began coming to Puerto Cabezas 15 years ago.
Comencé a viajar a Puerto Cabezas desde hace 15 años, cuando recién comencé.
The students went out with cameras and brought back images of people cooking, fishing, making wabul, watching baseball games, worshiping in church. It's an amazing record of ordinary life from several different communities. One of the assignments I gave was to do an interview with an older person in a community for whom they had respect, to find out what this community was like 50 years ago. Huracan since has continued the project. These are the young people who produce public access television. I really enjoy going down there, and over the years I've tried to go on as many delegations as possible. Most years I get down there, and we try to bring people from Burlington and then connect them with their counterparts down there. I've found Puerto Cabezas to be like a second home. My working methods are not much different whether I'm in Puerto Cabezas or Winooski. Of course, in Winooski, much of my photography has been prompted by dramatic transformations of the downtown area. Most of the changes that happen do not take into consideration the social fabric, but has some kind of outside idea about what it ought to be.
It wasn't until 2003 that parking lot that was once a vibrant neighborhood was actually developed for housing and offices and apartments.
When the town got rebuilt in that same area, I set a time-lapse camera in the same window. In the 1990s, the population of Winooski began to change drastically again, and Winooski became one of the major refugee resettlement areas in Chittenden County. It still is, as far as I know. And a lot of groups are coming in from different cultures and different places. Periodically, I would revisit the onion theme. Now, it's a little different because a lot of these people didn't know what the onion represented. One of the first ones was a series of Vietnamese groups. And I went with Mr. Thuy, who was a Vietnamese man I met up at the school, and he would talk to people, and somehow, I don't know what he would say, but he convinced them that it was really important to be photographed with an onion. That's now that they were living in Winooski. And I asked people to include in their photograph something of the place they'd come from. Here's a picture of a Vietnamese family. I love this picture. It's got the wedding pictures. They're obviously a Christian family. The mother, as I understand it, made those dresses because that was a very popular mode in Vietnam at the time. And I would give people their picture after we made it, and a lot of these became really important sending back to relatives. I think around 2000, when all the so-called Lost Boys started arriving, those really tall Sudanese guys, and they were great. They wanted a picture of a lion. They had this lion quilt. They wanted Michael Jordan in there. They've got their computer. One of them wanted to be a king. He's wearing a Burger King crown. This is a family from Iraq. I don't ever show up with a camera. I talk and I show them what I'm doing, and I come back at a certain date. Usually a week later, they had gone up to Montreal and gotten the ingredients to create an Iraqi meal. This is a daughter of theirs that was still in Iraq. There's a picture of her on the wall. She's still wrapped in cellophane because it has a kind of honorable place. This is a family that I met through their daughters at the school, the English as a second language. Great daughters, they're from Bosnia. So I met them and I said, all right, I'm coming back next week. When I got back, you can see there's more than 4 people in this picture. These are all aunts and cousins. They had both been in the same refugee camp. They didn't know where the other parts of the family had been sent, and they ran into each other on Church Street, which I thought was really extraordinary. So they've got a picture of their mosque here that was burned down. The aunts all put on their traditional garb.
How do you make your first introduction?
Well, if I speak the language, it's a lot easier. I show pictures.
You knock on the door?
Sometimes. But yeah, they brought their extended family. The ritual, I mean, having a tripod gives it a kind of something. And this is the camera that I absolutely love. I really regret not using it more now. It's a twin-lens reflex camera. You hold it at your waist, so you keep eye contact. You're looking down this way. It's got dark slides in it that you got to remember to take out, or the film won't get. Remember we did one wedding, and I was one of your weddings, and I thought, oh, God, what if I didn't take the dark? This is a real clunker. It's got different backs that go on it. It's got different ways of putting it together. It doesn't look like a camera. It looks like an Edsel, if you remember that car. and it makes people, it has a very different sense of importance. It's the perfect camera for the way I felt like working. And it is awkward, and you always, did I really do that right? Did I, it's fussy.
But it brings a lot of ceremony.
It does. People, I think, begin to almost empathize a little with this guy that doesn't know what he's doing. In my last decade or so with the UVM art department, I taught one course called Photography and Community, where we looked at photographers who set up situations. One of my favorite photographers, Milton Rogovan, and he, for years, has just worked portraits of people in a small East Buffalo neighborhood and gone back year after year after year. And he's one of the photographers I really admire. That's what this book, Encountering Community Through Photography, is about. These were some of the issues that came out of that class. That was my favorite class. What they had to do was, A, stop taking photographs and make them, where you're some kind of collaborating with someone. And it's theater. You're setting things up. And then connecting and strategizing was the second step. And that's the tricky part, where how do you begin to connect with the community particularly one that you're not part of. When I go into a community, I try to find out what people who are living there find unique or special about their community. And I was drinking coffee at the bagel shop where a number of people referred me to Fern's yard. And that's how Fern's Flamingos ended up in the magazine. Now, constructing the narrative, part 3 was, what is the story that you're trying to work with people to say? You're a director, but you want to have input from the people. But as a photographer, you're in charge of lighting, and sound and listening to squeaky boots, and, all those kind of technical things. That's kind of your job. And then listening input happens during the process where you're putting those photographs out and you're seeing how people respond to them. And generally, if people feel that they can identify with that narrative, they want to be part of it. And exhibiting the photographs is the one where you take the whole body of work, because the work is really about the community, and you find a place to show it publicly. We're walking now over to the Block Gallery Coffee House in downtown Winooski. And what we are going to see are a series of photographs that I have made in collaboration with people who have done postings on Winooski's Front Porch Forum. I was curious to know more about the people that post, what they look like, and then to create an event where possibly all of those people might actually meet each other, which is what the exhibit is about. Almost always when I start a project, I make a book to go around and talk to people about what I'm doing. So this is the first one, actually, Eggs for Sale.
I love it because it feels like the Winooski community's really alive.
I said, I'd like to photograph you and your chickens. She said, well, I have a husband, I have a baby. This is the picture that we ended up making. I'm lying down in the chicken coop. I will tell you, although not many people know that, the chickens were not behaving the way I wanted them to, and I shot them individually and reinserted them in Photoshop.
I'm gonna tell.
These are people that had a requiem for a tree. A tree had fallen down in their yard, and they asked if people wanted to come and get some wood for sculpture. This is the Winooski I love. I knock on the door. He says, come on in. I just made a gin and tonic, and I hung out with them for about an hour. And then I came back, and they posed with their tree. These people were making hard cider, and they wanted to know if people had apples. And I'd actually let them come down and have some of my apples. But this is easier because you had the writing, you already had the story. Here's one of my favorites. More beware of dog. I believe you are talking about the only terrier on the street. Someone had badmouthed his dog. You shouldn't be misinforming people. My terrier is a very loving dog. He does not nip, yelp, or go chasing other dogs. A woman that posts almost every day, but she spells her name Terry. And that was one of the most fun things at the opening, because a lot of these people, if they're in it, they come. And they would go up to her and they say, oh my God, you're Terry. I thought you were a man. And of course, pedestrian frustration over crossing Winooski's roundabout. With the current configuration of Winooski, with the roundabout in the middle and new housing on one side, the population has become much more isolated in different enclaves. This is a very difficult street to cross, which is one of the topics most spoken about on Front Porch Forum, that and the F-35.
The Air Force wants to bed the new military jet at the Air National Guard base, jets that would fly directly over some parts of Winooski.
The debate about landing the new military fighter jet at the Vermont Guard base goes on.
The people have voted that they don't want these things located in Vermont's heaviest populated area. These are purported to be 4 times louder than the current F-16s, which are horrendous. The noise levels of the F-35s is going to drastically impair the quality of life in Winooski. At one of the protests in Winooski, I photographed each of the individual people with their signs. The problem with documenting the F-16s is noise. It's hard to photograph audio. In my video work, I have responded as best I can. I have worked with groups opposing the F-35s.
So we're here to represent thousands of Vermonters, including
members of the active military, Guard, Reserve veterans who are against the immoralities of the F-35 basing.
I spent a week with Roseanne Greco trying to get Senator Leahy's office to respond to some of the complaints. On the first day, Roseanne and Roger were arrested for refusing to leave the office. Later on during the week, Senator Leahy's office remained locked. Protests took place in the hallway outside the office. This is seen as another example of Vermont's political leaders regarding Winooski's neighborhoods and the people who live in them as expendable.
And nobody's saying that this plane has no right to exist. We're saying, please put it somewhere else. That's all we're asking.
By June, the Guard will have 20 F-35s, 18 for combat, and 2 backup planes.
Between cups of coffee, Dan Higgins is trying to stir conversation, even among strangers. He says it's going to take a little bit of suspension of disbelief.
The show at Scout was part of trying to identify venues where people gathered in Winooski in the current environment. I took photographs I'd made of groups in Winooski, and I digitally collaged them onto pictures of buildings. That image is on the side of the Key Bank parking lot. The group is real. Projecting it into a public space is a digital fantasy. So the little show I did at Scout was kind of what I wished I could do with these pictures, but didn't have the budget.
Just a quick walk down the road, and you'll find this. Just a plain brick wall. So he didn't actually put up big photos around the city.
There are a lot of people, their idea of Winooski is that one block, but they don't have any idea what's going on. Maybe they'll go as far as Papa Frank's, but you go another block and they're lost. I wanted to think about how I could make these pictures available to the all-inclusive population.
Bringing his idea to life and hopefully bringing people together.
As Winooski started to change, especially with people from other countries and other cultures, Dan, I think, was instrumental in helping to get people together at the community center and to get them to photograph and to talk, so that he had a lot to do with community building. Sister Pat, the peace initiative that she got a grant for was to make community safer, because there'd been a shooting in Winooski and there were some drug problems. So we collaborate on things. The premise was to create a situation where people were maybe a little less apprehensive of each other. I, during much of last year, was trying to connect with these different groups. A really interesting, generous in terms of what he wanted photography to be about. And what Dan has done is more subtle. It's not as obvious, because he's dealing with, I think, a group of people who are maybe under the radar, especially in these later works that he's doing at the O'Brien Center. It's not like he's trying to expose an injustice or plead for a cause. I think what he's trying to make us look at is, oh, look, you normally wouldn't have the opportunity to go to the O'Brien Center unless you were a participant of some sort. When Sister Pat started the Winooski Peace Initiative, one of the concerns was that people were feeling a little bit, what's the word, Sister Pat?
Disconnected.
Disconnected.
Isolated.
Isolated. And I said, okay, I love working with photography. I will go out, I will try to access as many of these enclaves as I can. And when photographs are shown in the same context where they were made, it becomes a catalyst for people telling stories. And that, to me, is a lot more important than people looking and saying, oh, these are really nice photographs. I did a family room, and the woman working there said, why don't you just hang out with us today? So I sat down, and there was games and stuff. I said, this is the most relaxing half hour of the week. Who knows about that group, right? Certainly not at the VFW, which is where a lot of the old, really fun Winooski people hang out and drink beer and tell stories. The library has been asking people to drop off old electronic equipment, and on Tuesdays, these kids are given screwdrivers and pliers, and they pull it apart.
They're all inventing. They have great use of the VHS cassette. It's great for making masks. This is the Somali Bantu Community Association. Saturday nights, they play this incredible game called Ludo. It's so dramatic. It's dice, and they're pounding it down. Ann Linton, she puts out the monthly school bulletin that goes to every house in Winooski. Friday morning coffee hour is one of the best deals in Winooski. You can see Sister Germaine here with the pastries. Sister Pat gets Starbucks coffee. Understanding promotional, she had everyone hold their Starbucks coffee cups toward the camera.
Winooski Farmers Market. I don't know this girl, but I feel like I do, just because of the way he catches her. Everyone is important.
They're literally popping out of the photograph. I really feel like they're ready to kind of move out of the picture.
And look at all the different people and the different groups and how active they all are. I mean, this makes you love your city.
Does anybody back there recognize anyone in these pictures that you could say something about?
Yeah.
Connie, who do you know?
I know him. That's my Uncle Moraz. My uncle.
That's your uncle?
Moraz.
So it's not unlike what all of these projects have been, but it's just a little different because it's harder. You don't have a common space now where people are all walking past the same windows.